are standing in the praetorium in Jerusalem. It is early morning. All four Gospels agree on this, and it is one of the few details they all record the same way. Early, before the city is fully awake. Before the market stalls open and the street noise rises above the stone walls, Pilate has already heard the case. He has questioned the prisoner. He has formed his judgment. You can see the calculation in his face. Not the face of a man in anguish, not the face of someone whose sleep was troubled by this. This is a man who has made decisions like this hundreds of times, and the weight of each one fell into routine years ago. He steps out to face the crowd, and he says it clearly. I find no guilt in this man. You wait. The crowd does not accept it. He says it again. Still, the crowd refuses. Something shifts in the air. A phrase cuts through the noise. 4 words, not shouted, spoken with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, aimed directly at what Pilate cannot afford to lose. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. You watch Pilate's face change. Not in grief, not the way the paintings show it. The tormented Roman, the man of reluctant conscience, the leader who tries to do right and is overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. What you see is something more recognizable than that. You have seen it before, maybe not in a Roman praetorium, maybe somewhere smaller. A meeting room, a conversation where you said what you knew was true, and the room went quiet in a particular way. The moment when honesty and survival stop pointing in the same direction and you feel the exact distance between them in your chest before you feel it anywhere else. He calls for water. He washes his hands. He gives the order. And 2,000 years later, the church teaches that the crowd made him do it. The 4 Gospels disagree on almost everything. That is not an overstatement or an argument against the tradition. It is the documented textual record. Sit down with a parallel gospel chart. 4 columns, same events, 4 accounts side by side, and the variations accumulate quickly. The timing of the Last Supper relative to Passover, the details of conversations. Who was present at which moments? Which women went to the tomb on Easter morning and what they found there? The Gospels are 4 separate compositions written by 4 separate authors across several decades, and they show those differences in nearly every chapter. But they agree on this, all 4 of them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 writers who contradict each other on dozens of specific details. 4 writers who could not agree on whether Jesus was crucified on the day of Passover or the day before it. All 4 of them record that Pontius Pilate declared Jesus innocent. Mark chapter 15, verse 14. Pilate responds to the crowd's demand. What evil has he done? Luke chapter 23, verses 4, 14, and 22. Pilate says it explicitly, 3 separate times. I find no guilt in this man. And 3 declarations across a single trial, including a referral to Herod Antipas, who also finds no fault. John chapters 18 and 19. Pilate declares Jesus innocent 3 times, across an extended private dialogue that includes the philosophical exchange. What is truth? That appears in no other gospel. All 4. The one detail they could not let go. The Roman prefect declared the prisoner innocent. Now hold that against what comes next. John chapter 19, verse 16. So Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. 8 words. No moral reflection. No explanation of what changed. The man who said 3 times, I find no guilt in this man, signed the order. A few years ago, I sat in on a graduate seminar in Indianapolis, a course on comparative gospel accounts. The assignment was to chart the trial of Jesus across all 4 Gospels in parallel columns. What Pilate says, how many times he says it, what he does, what the crowd does. I filled in the columns methodically, the way I used to do concordance audits, just tracking what the texts actually say without interpretation. By the time I finished, I had something in front of me I hadn't quite prepared for. The prefect who signed the execution order had declared the prisoner innocent 3 times in 2 of the 4 accounts. And none of those accounts explained what reversed that verdict. They described the reversal. They didn't explain it. I wrote a question in the margin of my legal pad, not a theological question, a procedural one. What actually happened in the space between the declaration and the order? Let me give you the historical Pilate, not the gospel portrait. The one that comes from sources who had nothing to gain from flattery, writing within living memory of his administration. Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher born around 20 BCE, died around 50 CE. He wrote about Pilate in a work called On the Embassy to Gaius, within roughly 2 decades of the crucifixion, closer in time than any of the Gospels. He was not a Christian and had no theological interest in the trial of Jesus. He described Pilate as a man of, in his direct words, an inflexible, stubborn, and cruel disposition. He described Pilate's administration as characterized by briberies, violence, robberies, tortures, wanton injuries, executions without trial constantly repeated, and the ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. That is a direct quote. Philo wrote that about a specific person who was still, in some circles, alive when he wrote it. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian writing his Antiquities and Jewish War later in the 1st century, records 3 separate incidents under Pilate's administration. The military standards incident. Pilate brought Roman standards bearing Caesar's image into Jerusalem, violating Jewish religious law, and threatened a massacre of protesters before backing down only when the crowds offered their necks to his soldiers. The Corbonas incident. Pilate used funds from the temple treasury to finance an aqueduct, and when Jews protested, he had soldiers dressed in civilian clothes attack the crowd with clubs, causing significant deaths in the chaos. The Samaritan massacre. Pilate attacked a crowd of Samaritans at Mount Gerizim and had their leaders executed. And this incident was serious enough that the Syrian legate Vitellius recalled him to Rome to answer for it in 36 or 37 CE. And there is a detail inside the Gospels themselves. Luke chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Some people came to Jesus and told him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. That is a reference to a massacre so routine in the context of Pilate's administration that it is mentioned as background knowledge. No surviving source records which specific incident this refers to. It was apparently not significant enough to document independently. Pilate had carried out enough mass violence that events lost to the historical record were referenced as common knowledge inside the gospel tradition itself. Now, pay attention to this. Every single one of these sources, Philo writing within living memory, Josephus documenting 3 separate incidents, and Luke's own gospel making an offhand reference to a massacre, agree on something the trial accounts do not reflect. Pontius Pilate was not a man given to moral scruple over executing Jewish prisoners. He was, by every external measure, exactly the kind of prefect who executed first and documented later. A man with that record does not need a crowd to demand it 3 times before acting. A man with Pilate's documented history of mass violence does not require theatrical motivation from a religious authority to carry out a single execution. The gap between the historical Pilate and the gospel Pilate is not a minor discrepancy, it is enormous. And it forces the question the Church has spent 2 millennia not answering directly. Why does the gospel Pilate look nothing like the man the contemporaneous records describe? You are trying to hold 2 portraits of the same man at the same time. On one side, you have the trial accounts, a man who is troubled, who keeps asking the crowd to specify the crime, who keeps seeking a way out, who addresses the crowd 3 times and finds no answer, who calls for water to wash his hands, who is, in the Gospels, the closest thing the trial scene has to a figure of genuine moral uncertainty. On the other side, you have Philo, writing within living memory of the man with no theological interest in his behavior, describing executions without trial, constantly repeated, ceaseless, and supremely grievous cruelty. You have Josephus recording soldiers with hidden clubs attacking protesters. A Samaritan massacre that ended a career. Luke's own offhand reference to Galileans whose blood was mixed with their sacrifices, as though this were the kind of thing that needed no elaboration. Two portraits. Same name, same title, same province, same decade. You look at them side by side for a long time, and then you notice something about one of the portraits. It was written by people who needed the Roman Empire to tolerate them. People spreading a new religion through Roman cities under Roman law in a world where the state that had executed their founder could also exterminate their communities. People for whom writing that death as a straightforward Roman state execution, willing Roman executioner, clear Roman motivation, would have been politically catastrophic. The other portrait was written by people who had nothing to gain from flattery. That is not a small distinction. That is the difference between testimony and theology. In 1961, an Italian archaeologist named Antonio Frova was excavating the Roman theater at Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea Maritima was Pilate's administrative headquarters. Not Jerusalem, which was politically and religiously charged, but the coastal city built by Herod the Great for his Roman patrons. This is where the prefect of Judaea ran the day-to-day operations of the province, where dispatches from Rome arrived, where administrative decisions were made away from the religious tension of the capital. Frova's team found something in the stone, a limestone block, partially damaged, embedded in one of the theater structures. The inscription was incomplete but legible. The first line reads what scholars reconstruct as Pontius Pilate, and the second as Prefectus Judaea. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. This is the only Latin inscription with Pilate's name on it that has ever been found. One stone, 2,000 years after his administration ended, in the ruins of a coastal theater. It is currently in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, a block of limestone roughly 80 centimeters across, chipped and worn, the letters still readable. The stone confirms two things the Gospels record accurately: his name and his title. The Gospels call him hegemon, the Greek word for ruler or governor. The Latin prefectus is the exact administrative equivalent. His name was right, his title was right, his historical existence is not in question. What the stone cannot tell you is anything about the man. For that, you have the written sources. Philo, Josephus, Luke's passing reference to a massacre, the Samaritan incident that cost him his career, a record consistent enough across independent witnesses that when Vitellius finally recalled him to Rome, no one in the province appears to have argued it was unfair. One stone with his name on it, every other surviving record pointing in exactly the opposite direction from the gospel portrait. That is the gap I keep coming back to. That gap has a history. Let me walk you through the 4 trial accounts side by side. The contradictions are not marginal. The first is timing. Mark and Matthew place the Last Supper as the Passover meal itself, meaning the trial and crucifixion happen on the first day of Passover. John chapter 18 verse 28 is explicit in the other direction. The Jewish leaders bringing Jesus to Pilate did not enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled before eating the Passover. In John, the Passover meal has not yet happened at the moment of the trial. The crucifixion falls the day before Passover, not on it. These are not compatible timelines. The second is what Pilate says and how many times. In Mark, the earliest gospel, Pilate says, "What evil has he done?" He implies he finds no charge, but never explicitly declares innocence. He gives way to the crowd without extended deliberation, without multiple declarations, without theatrical gestures of exoneration. By Luke, Pilate declares Jesus innocent 3 times and sends him to Herod Antipas for a second hearing. By John, Pilate has a private philosophical exchange with Jesus. "I am the truth. What is truth?" that appears in none of the other 3 accounts. The third is Pilate's wife. She exists only in Matthew chapter 27 verse 19. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message. have nothing to do with that innocent man. For today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." That verse, the prefect's wife, her prophetic dream, her private warning delivered mid-trial, is unique to Matthew. The other three Gospels do not record her at all. The fourth is the hand-washing. Matthew 27, verse 24. When Pilate saw that he could do nothing, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." That scene is only in Matthew. No Roman legal source records any practice of hand-washing as a gesture of disclaiming legal responsibility. Roman law had no such ritual, but Jewish law did. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 6 and 7, the prescribed ritual for elders disclaiming responsibility for an unsolved death, describes washing hands and declaring our hands did not shed this blood. The author of Matthew placed a Jewish ritual of legal exoneration in the hands of a Roman prefect, performed publicly before a Jewish crowd. The author of Matthew knew exactly what he was doing. The fifth is Barabbas. All four Gospels record a custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. Mark, Matthew, Luke, John stated as an established practice. A seasonal amnesty Pilate extends as routine. No Roman source confirms this practice. No Jewish source outside the Gospels confirms it. Not Josephus, who documented Pilate's administration in significant detail. Not Philo. Not any rabbinic text from the period. Raymond Brown, in his 2-volume The Death of the Messiah, one of the most exhaustive scholarly analyses of the trial accounts in the 20th century, acknowledged the absence of external confirmation directly. The Paschal privilege appears in 4 Gospels and nowhere else in the ancient world, and the name of the man released, Barabbas, Barabba in Aramaic, means son of the Father. The crowd in the Gospel narrative chooses the man literally named Son of the Father over the man who called himself Son of the Father. Whether that is history or literary architecture, the Gospels do not resolve. 4 trial accounts, 1 series of events, specific, documented contradictions in timing, dialogue, the declarations of innocence, the wife, the hand-washing ritual, the Barabbas custom. What are they agreeing on? What are they each doing differently? The answer to the second question tells you something the first question cannot. Now look at the dates. Scholars broadly agree on when the Gospels were composed. Mark is earliest, written around 70 CE, roughly 40 years after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke come later, generally placed in the range of 80 to 90 CE. John is latest, around 90 to 100 CE. Here is what I noticed when I traced those dates against the Pilate entries in my parallel columns. In Mark, the earliest account, Pilate is the most procedurally neutral. He asks what evil has he done. He notes that the crowd is motivated by envy. He gives way. He is complicit, but he is not given extended dialogue, not given multiple explicit declarations of innocence, not given a wife with a prophetic dream. He is a prefect doing what prefects do. By Luke, written a decade or two later, Pilate has become explicitly and emphatically innocence declaring. 3 times, he refers the case to Herod Antipas, who also finds no guilt. He is structurally positioned as a man who tried everything available to him. By Matthew, roughly contemporary with Luke, Pilate receives a divine warning through his wife's dream and performs a Jewish exoneration ritual before the crowd. He is being architecturally exonerated by the text. By John, the latest Gospel, written when Christianity was establishing itself in Roman cities across Asia Minor and Greece, Pilate has a private philosophical dialogue with Jesus. He asks, "What is truth?" The Jewish leaders in John are the ones who say we have no king but Caesar. The most sympathetic, most extended, most intellectually sophisticated portrait of Pilate in any of the 4 accounts appears in the text written last. The later the Gospel, the more sympathetic Pilate becomes. Helen Bond, professor of Christian origins at the University of Edinburgh. In her Cambridge University Press study, Pontius Pilate, in History and Interpretation, argues that the varying gospel depictions reveal less about the historical Pilate than about the theological and political concerns of the gospel writers themselves. Her conclusion? The gospel writers were not writing biography. They were writing theology in a Roman context. Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, one of the most widely read New Testament scholars in the English-speaking world, makes the political logic explicit. The Gospels were written as Christianity was trying to establish itself as a tolerated religion within the Roman Empire. Making the founder's death the direct and willing responsibility of a Roman official was not compatible with that project. Making it the result of Jewish religious leaders who manipulated a reluctant Roman into an unjust verdict was. The progressive exoneration of Pilate across 4 Gospels and 3 decades tracks exactly with Christianity's expansion into the Roman world. The later the Gospel, the bigger Christianity got. The bigger Christianity got, the nicer Pilate became. And Ehrman names what that editorial strategy cost. The redirection of blame from the Roman state to the Jewish religious leadership accumulated across 4 gospel accounts that would be read and preached for 2,000 years, became the theological root of Christian anti-Semitism. The crowd demanding death. The Jewish leaders forcing Pilate's hand. The mob choosing Barabbas. Those narrative details, layered across 4 texts over 3 decades, told a story about Jewish culpability for the crucifixion that was not just inaccurate, it was catastrophic. The stakes of how Pilate was written were not theological, they were civilizational. You have been in rooms where 4 words changed everything. Maybe not these 4, maybe something else. Spoken across a table, in a conversation where you thought you understood how things were going to go. And then a phrase landed and you felt the room reorganize around it. Not threatened in a dramatic way. Just suddenly clear about what was at stake. About the distance between what you knew was right and what you could afford to do about it. You know that calculation. The moment when honesty and survival stop pointing in the same direction, and you feel the distance between them before you can articulate it. It is not weakness. It is arithmetic. What I keep if I comply. What I lose if I don't. Pilate is running that arithmetic. His patron in Rome, the man who probably arranged his appointment, the most powerful figure in the empire after Tiberius himself, has been executed for treason. Every client of that patron in every province is exposed. Pilate is standing in a territory he has already nearly lost twice over incidents that are part of the documented historical record. He has a record he knows, as Philo noted, he cannot afford to have examined in detail before the emperor. And then 4 words arrive from across the courtyard. You are no friend of Caesar. That phrase, amicus Caesaris, friend of Caesar, was not a casual social category in Roman administrative culture. It was a formal political designation, to be explicitly declared not a friend of Caesar, especially by a delegation capable of carrying a report directly to Tiberius, was not an insult. It was a threat with specific legal and professional consequences. Pilate already knows what the calculation adds up to. The water is being called for before he finishes thinking it through. He knows exactly what he is about to do. He also knows exactly why. Let me give you the specific history behind those 4 words. Lucius Aelius. Sejanus was the Praetorian prefect under the Emperor Tiberius, not just the commander of the imperial guard, but effectively the second most powerful man in Rome. While Tiberius was in semi-retirement on the island of Capri, Sejanus administered much of the empire on his behalf. He controlled appointments. He controlled access to the emperor. He was a kingmaker, and the kings he made knew it. Pilate's appointment to Judea, roughly in 26 CE, almost certainly passed through Sejanus. On October 18th, 31 CE, Sejanus was arrested, executed, and his body thrown down the Gemonian steps in Rome. Tiberius had turned on him. A purge followed. Clients, allies, and associates throughout the provinces were suddenly vulnerable to accusation, investigation, and removal. Every prefect and governor who owed his position to Sejanus's patronage was exposed, with no protective layer between himself and a suspicious emperor. Pilate was one of them. The probable dates for the crucifixion range from 30 to 33 CE. Either date places the event in the exact window of Pilate's maximum political vulnerability, the period when Sejanus was falling or had just fallen, when Tiberius was actively purging former clients, when a report from Judea about a prefect who released a man claiming to be king of the Jews could trigger imperial investigation. John chapter 19, verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." The details in that verse are extraordinary. Pilate was trying to set him free. The mechanism that stopped him was not the volume of the crowd. It was not the Barabbas custom. It was not his wife's dream. It was the specific invocation of the amicus Caesaris category, the explicit threat that releasing a man who claimed kingship would be reported to Tiberius as an act of disloyalty from a prefect who was already politically exposed. A man claiming to be king of the Jews was not a religious problem. In Roman terms, a king claims rival sovereignty over territory that belongs to Caesar. Releasing such a man in Pilate's current political position was not merciful. It was a career-ending vulnerability at a moment when he had no one in Rome to intercede for him. I want to sit with that for a moment, because if John 19:12 contains the most historically realistic sentence in any of the 4 trial accounts, and multiple historians have argued that it does, then the question of what reversed Pilate's verdict has a specific and verifiable answer. Not crowd psychology, not moral cowardice, not the weight of a mob he felt unable to resist. Structural entrapment. The verdict reversed because a prefect without patronage, with a record he could not afford to have examined, could not survive a report to Tiberius. The crowd wasn't operating the machinery, the crowd was standing in front of it. Now consider what Barabbas means inside all of this. All 4 Gospels record the paschal privilege, the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover, stated as established practice, something Pilate extends routinely. The crowd is given a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. They choose Barabbas. Jesus is condemned. No Roman source confirms this practice ever existed. No Jewish source outside the Gospels confirms it. Not Josephus, who documented Pilate's administration in significant detail. Not Philo. Not any rabbinic text from the period. Raymond Brown's exhaustive scholarly analysis of the trial accounts acknowledged the problem directly. The paschal privilege is attested in 4 Gospels and nowhere else in the ancient world. It is either a genuine local custom that no one outside the Gospel tradition thought worth recording, or it is a literary construction designed to serve the narrative. What the Barabbas episode accomplishes, structurally, is the distribution of moral responsibility. Pilate offers the crowd a choice. The crowd chooses wrong. The blood falls on those who demanded it, not on the prefect who had 3 times declared the prisoner innocent. The hand-washing in Matthew makes this architecture explicit. See to it yourselves. The name Barabbas in Aramaic is Bar Abba, son of the Father. The crowd in the Gospel narrative releases the man literally named Son of the Father and condemns the man who called himself the Son of the Father. Whether that is history or deliberate literary irony, it is structured to carry weight. J.J. Benitez has returned to the trial of Jesus across decades of investigation, and the framework he keeps arriving at is something he calls the machinery of institutional survival. His argument is not conspiratorial, it is institutional. Structures that need to survive will convert the individual judgments of their operators into outcomes those individuals privately oppose. This happens through procedure, through precedent, through the application of pressure at exactly the point where compliance costs least and resistance costs most. Pilate declared the prisoner innocent. The machinery converted that verdict into an execution order. The church taught for 2,000 years that the crowd forced his hand, that the Jewish religious leadership manipulated a reluctant Roman, that Pilate, who washed his hands, who tried 3 times, who was warned in a dream, was as much a victim of the mob as the man he condemned. What the historical record, the textual chronology, and John 19:12 together describe is something more specific. The crowd was not the mechanism. The crowd was the theater. The mechanism was a dead patron in Rome. It had a name, Sejanus. It had a date, October 31 CE. It had 4 words, "You are no friend of Caesar." And it converted a declaration of innocence into a signed execution order in the time it took to call for a bowl of water. Nobody asks who built the machinery. 2,000 years later, that question is still open. I still have that chart. 4 columns on a legal pad, written on a Tuesday afternoon in Indianapolis under fluorescent library lights with a coffee cup going cold on the table beside me. Column 1. Mark, the most procedurally neutral account. Pilate complicit but not elaborated. No wife, no hand-washing, no philosophical dialogue. Written in 70 CE, before Christianity's major Roman expansion. The Pilate who is least exonerated. Column 2. Matthew, the wife and her dream. The water and the hands. I am innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves. A Jewish ritual of exoneration placed in Roman hands, performed before a Jewish crowd. The author knew his audience. Column 3. Luke. 3 declarations of innocence. The referral to Herod. The Barabbas mechanism deployed twice. A prefect who appears to be searching across the entire structure of the trial narrative for an exit the text will not allow him to find. Written a decade after Mark. Column 4. John, the private philosophical dialogue. What is truth? The amicus Caesaris threat spelled out in detail that appears nowhere else. The Jewish leaders declaring, "We have no king but Caesar." The most sympathetic portrait of Pilate in any of the 4 accounts in the text written last when Christianity was deepest into the Roman world. I drew the gospel dates in the margin and put an arrow pointing from left to right. 70 CE, 80 to 85, 80 to 90, 90 to 100. I wrote underneath, Pilate getting nicer, Christianity getting bigger. Then I looked at the Philo quote I had written at the top of the page. Executions without trial constantly repeated, ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. And I looked at the arrow pointing right. And then I looked at John 19:12, which I had circled. 3 pieces of evidence. The external portrait of the man. The chronological pattern in how the Gospels constructed his role over 3 decades. The single verse that most historians find most politically credible. The one that explains the machinery rather than the crowd. They produce a picture that is not complicated to read once you let yourself look at it directly. A man with a documented record of mass violence declared a prisoner innocent. The machinery of his political exposure converted that verdict into an execution order. Successive gospel writers over 30 years softened his role incrementally, because the communities producing those gospels needed Roman tolerance to survive, and a founding story in which the Roman official is the willing executioner was not compatible with that need. The result, accumulated across 2 millennia of preaching and teaching and homily, was a narrative that moved the moral weight of the crucifixion from the institution that carried it out onto the crowd that stood in front of it. And Pilate ended up in the Apostles' Creed by name, suffered under Pontius Pilate, as the historical anchor of the crucifixion event. the only living human being named in the creed. Not identified as the man who ordered the execution, named as the man under whose administration it occurred. A passive construction. For a man who signed the order. I look at that chart sometimes, at the 4 columns and the arrow and the dates, and I think about the space between the declaration and the order. About what those 4 words did when they landed. About the water being called for before the calculation was finished. About what it means that for 2,000 years the blame pointed at the crowd. The chart is still on my legal pad. You decide what to do with this.